All right. Welcome in, everyone. My name is PH Irwin, Communications Coordinator here at SAANYS, and I welcome you to another SAANYS Pro Learning session. Today is a Power Hour webinar titled Tips for Supporting K-12 Multilingual Learners. And as we begin, please remain muted, but feel free to use the chat room throughout the session for any questions, and our presenter will get to you. Also, please be aware that this session is being recorded. And now I will turn it over to SAANY's Director of Professional Learning, Karen Bronson. Karen.
Thank you so much, PH, and welcome everyone on this beautiful day. Thank you for being here today and sharing your time with us. We are very excited about our presentation today, our Power Hour. As you know, Power Hours are really designed to delve into topics that help school leaders with the very complex work they do. And we like to have our attendees feel when they end the hour with us that they've really learned more about the topic and have more good strategies and learning to use in their practice. So today we're going to be talking about supporting K-12 multilingual learners. And as you all know, regardless of your specific role, no matter what your role is, supporting those learners has become a bigger and more integral and a vital part of the work that you do with students and with staff every day. So the more learning we can do together on this topic, the better. And so I am so happy to have my friend and colleague, Dr. Sarah Cioffi. Sarah was at Shenendehowa when I was there for a very long time, and she'll tell you a little bit about that. She retired as the K-12 Director of ENL at Shenendehowa, which is in Clifton Park, New York, and she's the founder and principal of SBC Instructional Consulting, as well as an adjunct professor in the graduate education program at Siena University and at Bard College. And Sarah's been doing terrific work around the state on all of the questions and issues that school leaders like you face in terms of supporting K-12 multilingual learners in your schools and districts. So without further ado, I really want to get right to it and welcome Sarah, and thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, PH, for that lovely intro. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. I just realized as I looked out the window that I'm standing between you and a really warm, sunny day. So hopefully you're either sitting by a window or sitting on your back deck. But thank you for joining us for this conversation. It is so vitally important that our school leaders have a really solid understanding, at least as much as possible, of all things ENL. I thank Karen for that introduction. I think probably the thing that is most relevant to the conversation today is my time at Shenandoah. As Karen said, I retired from there as the director of ENL. But what's probably more relevant to our conversation today is that in the course of about a decade, our L population exploded. It grew by 900% over the course of 10 years. So we really were, buried in lots of questions and lots of misunderstandings around all things related to ENL. So that's sort of what led me to do this work, which has basically given me the opportunity to work in lots of districts across New York State and including out of state, to just be working with teachers and administrators who are working in or leading buildings or programs or districts with English language learners. I typically show this slide at the end, but I decided today that given that we have 1 hour, and I'm going to fire hose a whole bunch of information at you during this hour. I'm just going to tell you up front, there's a lot to talk about. I'm going to share my contact information with you again at the end, but I wanted to make sure I shared it up front with you because I'm positive that you are going to have more questions. That's the nature of the work we do, and that's the nature of working with ELS. And I also see there's a variety of roles that you're coming from. And so your questions might be very distinct. And I want to just make sure I put out the invitation for you to reach out to me at any time with any questions. You can reach me through my website. You can call me. That's my cell phone number. You can text me if you want. You can email me. But I thought, you know what, today I'm going to put that out there right up front in the event that we get going, and I don't get to share that information with you. So there are really three big areas that I want to talk about today with you, and again, the very short time that we have. First, I want to sort of do an update on who our Ls are. Where are we as a state? Where are we in terms of our L population and what we need to know? And I also like to take a little bit of an opportunity when I have a somewhat captive audience to start thinking about what it feels like to be an L and to be, in the shoes of an English language learner. And by the way, you'll notice that I use the term English language learner. New York State has been moving toward multilingual learner. As have both the Sienna and BARD programs that I teach in. I'm trying to get there, but I will continue to refer to these, this group of students as English language learners, or multilingual learners. So the next part of the plan for this afternoon is really probably where we're going to spend the bulk of our time, because there's a lot that school leaders need to know. And then I've set aside some time to dig into MTSS and Ls a little bit, but just know that if we run out of time, that's okay, because Karen and I have talked about this, and hopefully in an upcoming session or at a future time, we can dig into MTSS and Ls very specifically in some time that's dedicated to that. I don't want to brush it off though, because I will say that in the work that I do in districts across the state of New York, the number one question I get these days is around MTSS, or some districts still refer to as RTI, primarily the identification of English language learners with potential disabilities. I can't think of a single place that I consult where that question doesn't come up, regardless of what we're working on. So I want to make sure I at least give a little bit of time to that, and maybe attack some of the big myths around it. And then hopefully at another date we can dig into it a little bit more. So let's start with who are our Ls. So the first thing I'd like to do is to start off strong here and ask if somebody would be willing to unmute and talk to us a little bit about what you enjoy most about being an educational leader. I know that sounds off topic a little bit, but would anybody be willing to just unmute and tell us what it is you enjoy most about leading schools or programs or districts?
I would say the ability, hi, I'm Dr. J. I would say the ability to share what you know and to move it forward. That's what's most important for me.
Okay. And what do you enjoy most about it, Dr. J?
I like coaching teachers, especially new teachers, and bringing them to the realization that all the students in their classes, in their class are Ls, and we have to find a way to have entry in all subject areas, especially when I look at it in high school lately.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. Can I
Yeah.
ask you to just continue as our victim?
Sure, why not?
Can you can you talk to us about how much you enjoy being an educational leader and what you enjoy about it? But this time I'm going to ask you to do it without using any words that contain the letter T.
Um, Share, inform, embrace.
So I won't make you suffer any further. You are a great volunteer. I appreciate that. And the reason I did that, you probably weren't expecting me to ask you that, but I thank you for that. Because one of the things that, again, when I have a group of folks together, whether they be teachers or administrators, it's a nice opportunity to kind of reset everybody's understanding of what it feels like to be an English language learner. And although it's a little bit contrived, I think the idea here is, I've just reduced your vocabulary pretty drastically. And so hopefully others on the call were thinking the same, what would I say? How would I say that? So talk to us a little bit about how that felt. So you had a lot to say. What happened when we essentially moved, reduced your vocabulary pretty drastically?
So I really had to stop and process and think. I didn't answer with automaticity. Um, it was difficult.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, it was challenging. I would say difficult, but especially on the spot. Maybe if I had a few more minutes, I would have jotted something down.
Yeah, but that's a really good point that you make, though, right? Because we often don't have the time, right? And very often we hear teachers talk about, having to cover content and they're sort of under the gun, right? They've got assessments waiting for them and they've got to get kids ready. And so sometimes it does feel a bit rushed. And so when we think about even just slowing down, it can be really hard to do that. But also the sense of frustration that you might feel when you have thoughts in your head and you want to be able to express them, but you're not able to because you don't have the vocabulary yet. So
Okay,
thank you for doing that. Um,
sure.
so let's sort of dig into, who our Ls are. Our Ls, our English language learners, are still the fastest growing population in US schools, and they're the fastest growing population in New York State schools. In New York State has right now the fourth highest population of English language learners after the states of Texas, California, and Florida. So we're quite high up there on the list. Anybody have a guess as to which state has the fewest English language learners, which has the smallest population of Ls? You can throw it in the chat or unmute.
Maybe Alaska.
Oh, good guess.
Mhm.
Other guesses? Ah, Karen, another good guess. It's actually our neighbor, Vermont. Vermont right now has the smallest population of Ls. So interesting. The state that's actually seen the highest percentage growth, so not just their raw number, but their percentage growth over the last 10 years is actually Rhode Island. They've seen quite a bit of growth. So in case you hadn't noticed, and you're working in a New York State school, the population of Ls has really, continued to grow and continue to explode. And one of the things as school leaders that we need to think about is we need to start thinking about our Ls as having, they're more than just Ls, right? Within an English language learner population, there are students that have very, very specific needs. So we often talk about them as a group, and we even look at data around them as a group, but we really need to be thinking about them as having very specific needs. Some of them are newcomers, right? They're brand new to the United States. Some of them are what we call students with interrupted formal education, or SIFE. Some people say SLIFE. Those are students that come to us that have had a significant interruption in their formal education. And so they bring a whole other challenge, with them. And so it's a good time to kind of stop and pause and think about how our Ls are doing right now. So when we think about sort of the L report card. And so I'm going to share with you over the next few slides some bad news. I'm gonna be the bearer of some less than good news, but I think it's important to understand. So we have the fourth largest population of Ls in the country out of 50 states. So we're high up there. This has been the fastest growing population for many years now. And where we're still struggling is in how well our Ls are doing in terms of graduation. If we look at the data from 2025, the high school graduation rate for English speaking students was 85%. And for Ls, it was 50%. So significantly lower. The dropout rate for non-Ls or English speaking students was 5%. But for our English language learners, it was 21%. So what we know right now is that Ls have the lowest graduation rate of all subgroups, including students with disabilities, and the highest dropout rate of all subgroups except for migrant students. Their dropout rate is actually 29%. But if you are a district with a large migrant population, you also probably know that many, if not most of our migrant students are also Ls. So there's some overlap there. And so this is the most recent data around graduation rates and dropout rates. And the other thing I need to mention is that this is actually worse than last year. Our graduation rate has dropped, our dropout rate has gone up. And to sort of pile on to the bad news, last year was worse than the year before. So we are actually starting to trend in a direction of our students achieving less. I'm often asked, why is this the case? Why, Sarah, do you think that, we're still struggling after all these years and having had English language learners and programs now? And I think that one of the biggest things that we need to think about as school leaders is the capacity of the teachers who are working with Ls. And so I want to throw a little bit of research at you here. And the first and foremost is we've known for some time that Ls really encounter very few teachers in the course of their day who are appropriately trained to meet their needs. And this one is staggering, in my opinion. And some of this is my own research. But in the state of New York, it is possible that an L could spend as much as 89% of their school day, so almost their entire school day, learning from teachers who have not had any training at all on how to teach them. And so when you think about that, it's pretty staggering and it can feel pretty overwhelming as a school leader too. So just any thoughts on who the 11% of the day is for Ls? Who has had the training that they need in order to work with Ls? And again, feel free to unmute or drop it in the chat.
The L specialized teacher?
Yeah. Yep. The ENL teacher is almost exclusively someone who has had extensive background in working with Ls. And so when it comes to school leaders, we also need to think about the research around school leaders. So I'm going to leave that on the screen for you to take a look at. So what we know about school leaders is that their understanding and ability to support those teachers is directly correlated to the success of those Ls. That even though sometimes as school leaders or district leaders or program leaders, we feel removed, we actually have a pretty significant impact on the success of those Ls. And this is a study done by Gretchen Oliver out of Siena University a few years ago, just sort of reiterating that same idea that leaders also need to have an understanding of how to enact practice in those practices in and out of the classroom in really transformative ways for our Ls to be successful. Here's what we also know. Despite all of that, here's what we also know. So what we know is that the state of New York has no requirement for leadership programs. So educational leaders in the state of New York, their preparation programs have no L requirement whatsoever. There's no requirement in the state of New York for administrator preparation programs to have any coursework at all on leading buildings or programs or districts with Ls. And so when we talk about teachers feeling unequipped, we really see this among school leaders as well. And Katie, to your point that teachers are required to get training based on the percentage of Ls in the district, all teachers of Ls are actually required to have training on working with Ls, even if a district is given a waiver. I'm going to come back to that and talk about that in some more detail. But the other thing that I found in my own research is that interestingly, in my study, I had participants from across the state of New York, and they were all teachers who were not they were not ENL teachers, and they had no co-teacher. So they were gen ed and content area teachers across the state of New York, including Long Island, but not including New York City. And I had a very statistically unique outcome of one of the parts of my study, and that was that 100% of my participants said they'd had zero coursework in their teacher preparation programs around working with Ls. And 65% of them said they had had no training in their districts around working with Ls. And to Katie's point, that's actually a requirement in New York State. So we'll talk about that in a moment. So the other piece that I want to leave you with, and this is sort of the hopefully the last of the bad news for today, but when I stand in, with school leaders and teachers and talk about English language learners and the struggles that they have, at the risk of sounding dramatic, it's really important to understand that I believe that our English language learners are our most at-risk population at this moment. They have been for a while. What really sort of drove this home for us in the field is that last summer a study came out that indicated to us that the suicidality rate of ELs is also significantly higher than that of their English speaking classmates. So our ELs, and this is a national study, not a New York State study, but in this national study, they noted that ELs are attempting suicide at a rate 5 times that of their non-EL peers. And in this same study, ELs reported facing higher rates of sadness, hopelessness, cognitive difficulties, and bullying, and lower rates of sleep and academic performance. And so again, at the risk of sounding dramatic, I sort of sit before you today and say that this population is our most at-risk population at this moment. And so given all of that, and that's a lot already, what do school leaders need to know? So the research says that there are certain fundamental things that school leaders need to understand in order to lead schools with ELs. Okay, so that's where we want to start. And so this graphic, although maybe strange, I think helps really to help people understand that when we're talking about English language learners, we're talking about students with many layers. Again, not just that they are newcomers or they are potential students with interrupted formal education, or that they potentially have a disability, right? Those are layers, right, that we know. But there are many other layers too, and that in order for us to really lead schools with English language learners, the research says there are a couple of things we really need to understand as leaders. So, and you'll see sort of the layers of this. So first and foremost, leaders need to have some understanding of second language acquisition. What is it? How does it work? How long does it take? So we'll talk about that. Then there are cultural considerations. And so we're adding another layer, right? So we're adding another layer to our understanding of these students because it impacts the work that we do and it impacts the work that we lead. And then finally, of course, we have to have a really solid understanding of E&L programming regulations. So I want to sort of touch on those, 3 things first and foremost. And I want to start with the cultural considerations. So when we talk about culture, and I ask the question, what is culture? If I were to ask you that, in fact, I am asking you that, what is that to you? What comes to mind when you think of culture? And you can unmute or you can drop it in the chat. What does that mean to you? What comes to mind when you think of culture?
Sort of religious, ethnic beliefs that a
Yep.
group of people have.
Yep. So we have religious observations, right?
Mhm.
Beliefs, ways of living in your home and in your community. I love that.
The food they eat.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Food. Anything else?
Cultural norms that they have. We all, each culture has their own norms.
Yep. And actually, and that's kind of where I want to dig in a little bit too. So
Yeah.
typically when I ask the question, what is culture? Very often, yep, language, thank you. That's a piece of culture as well. Customs, community, traditions. The thing that often comes out when we talk about culture is what we often refer to as surface culture. So I don't, if you've ever had the benefit of reading Zaretta Hammond's Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain, This is one of my favorite texts. We use it at Siena University in our TESOL program. I love the way she looks at culture because she describes it almost like a computer. It's a central processing unit, right? And everything that we experience gets filtered through that processing unit. And so another piece about that Hammond talks about is the culture tree. Some people use the culture iceberg, right? And so when you think about the things that people think of when they think of culture, they're very often surface culture. And by the way, that is not to say that it's any less important than shallow culture or deep culture, right? Traditions, clothes, language, literature, religious observances, these are all very important parts of a culture, but we know that they are the things that we're most comfortable with. We're the most familiar with them. We probably know the most about them, right? And very often we find that districts sort of stop here, right? They have the international dinner, right, where everybody brings a potluck meal, which again is very, very important for community building and for celebrating culture. But I would argue that when it comes to leading schools with L's and teaching L's, the rubber really hits the road at shallow culture. And so when we think about, and I'm going to use concepts of time as an example and tempo of work, they're somewhat related. Um, do I have any on the call? Do I have any Hispanohablantes? Okay. So, oh, okay. Elena, I see you said yes. I don't know if you are able to unmute, but you can also answer in the chat if that's easier. But the reason I ask is because there's something in Hispanic culture that we refer to as hora latina, and it's very understood in Latin culture. Elena, can you tell? And by the way, I've also learned in all of the work I've been doing with folks all across the state is that it's also referred to as Egyptian time and Italian time and Jamaican time. But Hora Latina is a very cultural concept. Do you want to tell us about that or give us an example?
Sure. In my experience, when I lived abroad in Madrid, I studied there for over 2 years. So, I was born here in the US, but Hora Latina, at least in Spain, for social situations, is you never arrive on the given time that they want you. So if they say 6 o'clock, it is rude to show up at 6 o'clock. You should show up later. Um, I'm not quite sure if I can speak to this accurately, but in professional settings, I do believe time is a little bit more um, the time that is given is the time that they show up, but I don't know that for sure. But I do know in social situations that was the norm.
Green
Yeah.
from HCC, who's running the ELM program that Jackson.
Yeah.
Just wanted to share the attached photo of the project Jackson did this semester. He assembled, wired, and debugged everything you see here. He is the gold standard of professionalism and shows the highest quality of workmanship possible. Really great work. Proud dad moment.
Oh my gosh, your picture.
So, yeah.
That's awesome.
I'm actually not
Start
able
ending the day well.
That's so nice.
So excited for him to get
Oh my gosh.
out of school and start excelling.
Doing it,
I can
right?
see him do good things.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome.
Karen, are you able to mute
That makes
that?
that all worth it.
Jennifer, can you mute?
Yeah.
Have a good night.
So, Elena, thank you. Jennifer, can you go ahead and mute for us? So, Elena, thank you for that. And by the way, I love your explanation because it's exactly my explanation too. It's the exact same one I use, and most of us learn this the hard way, right?
Yeah, you're very
Right?
welcome. But yes.
You're invited at 6 o'clock. You best not show up at 6 o'clock, right? And so even the concept of time is very different. And so when we think about this as school leaders, it's important to understand that if a student is showing up late to class regularly, or maybe they're not following deadlines, right? The way other students, are following deadlines. Yeah, it might be just that they're just showing up late to class or they're not following deadlines, but we want to make sure that we're thinking about it through a cultural lens as well. And so we first want to stop and think, is it possible that this is the culture the student either grew up in or in the school culture that they grew up in? Another one we talk about quite often, I'm going to skip to, is eye contact, right? Eye contact is, you're probably familiar with this notion that in many cultures, it is actually impolite to make direct eye contact. And so what I love is, as a program leader, I would walk into a building and I'd be visiting classes, and all day I would hear 1, 2, 3, and you know what comes next, right? Eyes on me. And some students aren't comfortable with that because they've been taught not to make direct eye contact. And so then we start asking questions like, is the student not paying attention? Is the student being impolite? So we have to be thinking about that as well. Nonverbal communication is another one we have to be very careful about. When we ask students to give a thumbs up on their understanding, a thumbs up in several cultures is actually quite rude and shouldn't be done. So these are some things that we sort of need to be thinking about. The other piece that we said is the understanding of second language acquisition. So I don't want to spend a lot of time here because we could spend semesters talking about second language acquisition, but it's important to know first and foremost that second language acquisition is only a somewhat linear process, that it is possible for students to regress in learning English. And so if you have students, for example, from, typically we'd see students from Pakistan very, very commonly who would go home to Pakistan in the middle of the school year, and then they'd get their 20-day letter, right? And they'd come back and they would find that they were what we would consider rusty. Or if you don't have a summer program for those students, sometimes you can see them regress a little bit when they come back to school. That's normal. The other thing around second language acquisition that's really important for leaders to understand is that it is also a long process. So when we're looking at data around ELS or we're thinking about programming for ELS, we need to remember that it actually takes years to become proficient or fluent in a language. And the other thing that's very important to note is that in those early years of second language acquisition, it's very common for students, or very normal, I should say, for students to hit what they call the silent period. I don't know if you've ever experienced the silent period or not, but it can be very jarring, and it kind of can kind of freak us out a little bit if we're not familiar with it. And it's very normal. It's a natural part of second language acquisition. Students typically just stop talking. It's important to note that when they do, it can last a day, it can last a few weeks. I'm working in a district now that has a student who is on their second year of a silent period, but it's important to understand that during that silent period, students are still learning and they are still acquiring content and language. They're just not speaking. So these are the kinds of things we want to be aware of. The other thing to be aware of is that the silent period is very often mistaken for a potential disability. And it's not that at all. So something to keep in mind. Okay, so I want to pause here and I need another volunteer. And I want to just talk for a moment about this process of second language acquisition, because there's another really important piece to it that school leaders need to know. Do I have another volunteer? I'll tell you what, unlike what I did to Dr. J, I'll tell you upfront what it is I want you to do. I want you to, using one syllable words only, tell us what you plan to do this summer. So one syllable words only, tell us what you plan to do this summer. Do I have a taker? You can even put it in the chat. Great answers. What else? Excellent. These all sound like great summer plans. Okay, so now the next thing I want you to do is, using only one syllable words again. Now I want you to tell me the difference between the three branches of US government. So again, using only one syllable words, what is the difference between the three branches of US government? So if you're like most people, you're finding that this is significantly harder to do, right? And so that brings us to sort of the final piece I want to say around second language acquisition, but important to understand is when you're talking about what you plan to do for the summer, that's very different language than the three branches of government or mitochondria or the French Revolution, or pick your content area, right? And so we need to have a really clear understanding of this notion of social language, which in our world we call basic interpersonal communication skills, and academic language, which we refer to as cognitive academic language proficiency, or CALP, right? So what we need to understand about these two is that social language comes much more rapidly and we're much more comfortable with it. Academic language takes significantly longer. So if you put yourself back into maybe middle school or high school and you think about learning language, and if you haven't studied language since high school or college, most people say, well, I still remember a few words, right? So if you think about what those few words are that you remember, they typically are social language. They're typically, my name is, right? Where's the library? I would like to order, a beer, right? This is social language, and that lasts much longer and we learn it much faster. And so the thing we need to understand here is that sometimes students at different proficiency levels can sound very proficient when they're talking about their weekend plans or their summer plans or the soccer game or what foods they like. And so we can sometimes then not understand that when they hit roadblocks in our content, that is typically because the academic language takes significantly longer for them to learn. And that academic language is the language of our content. It's the language of our textbooks. So those are sort of the big rocks around second language acquisition that we want to keep in mind. The other thing I want you to think about as we're sort of thinking about this onion with these layers. So now we're looking at their learning language, right? They have a variety of cultural characteristics that they bring with them. The other thing that we need to talk about when it comes to our English language learners is the stressors that they bring with them, that their English speaking classmates may or may not be experiencing. So what do we mean by that? So when you think of the stressors that your Ls are experiencing, or maybe bringing to school with them that their English speaking classmates are not, what comes to mind for you? Again, feel free to unmute or put it in the chat.
Not having anyone at home to bounce off of, being the actual translator for the family, having heavy responsibilities that way.
Yeah, that's a really important one. We did some focus groups of our Shenandoah students years ago, and we were trying to dig into attendance. And we asked our students, when you are not attending school, what is the number one reason you're not coming to school? And to a student, they told us in these focus groups that it was because they were out translating at the doctor's appointment for their mother or the car appointment for their uncle, right? So, yep. And feeling like an outsider, that's a really important one as well. And so when we think about the stressors that our Ls are experiencing, this goes again to the layers that we have to think about when we think about our L populations. Language is just one component of the things that Ls are navigating. They're also navigating potential trauma. They may be coming from a place where they experienced trauma, and more of our Ls are sort of fit that category. They may have experienced trauma to get here, right? The journey here may have caused them trauma. Many of them feel isolated. They're missing family, they're missing siblings, they're missing parents back home. It's impossible to talk about our English language learners and the stressors that they're experiencing today without talking about the fact that, regardless of your political position or your political belief, we really need to understand that this has probably been the most stressful time for our English language learners. There are kids who are disappearing from schools, and they are urban schools, they are rural schools, they are suburban schools. Families are disappearing. They're really, this has been a very, very trying time. And on top of that, what we also know is that there is a financial stressor too for our Ls. So just to give you a sense of that, in 2024, 59% of our school population in New York State was considered economically disadvantaged. 87% of our L population was considered economically disadvantaged. So they're also experiencing that as well. And the thing that we need to understand about that is that when our students are experiencing stress, whether that is any of the stressors that we've talked about, on top of learning the language, on top of potentially being a new student, What we know is that as long as those stressors are in place, that amygdala hijack is putting them in a place where really truly no learning can take place. Their cortisol levels are high, their higher cortex is disabled. Some people refer to this as fight or flight. If you've ever been in that situation, you know that very often you can't remember what you said or what you did. And some of our L's are walking through their day experiencing this all day, every day. So we have to be really cognizant of that. So that brings us to sort of the third piece of what school leaders need to know and be aware of. And that brings us to some key policies and legislation. So the big pieces of legislation that we as leaders of schools with L's need to be aware of are the Every Student Succeeds Act, because ESSA is now really embraced English language learners as a component of an ESSA score. The Commissioner's Regulations Part 154, these are the regulations that drive all E&L programming in New York State. The Blueprint for English Language Learner, Multilingual Learner Success, which was a document that was released to support the rollout of the new Commissioner's Regulations in 2014, but the vast majority of people I speak with have never heard of the Blueprint. So that's unfortunate, but we'll talk about that in a sec. And then, of course, the Culturally Responsive Sustaining Education Framework, which was revised in 2021. So talking about ESSA, just as a reminder, schools are scored based on 7 components. And the first 6 components are here, and your English language learners are subpopulations in all of those components. And with the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was an Obama era legislation, we added a 7th component, which was very specifically the proficiency level of English language learners. And so for the first time, L's really were something that the federal government was looking at in terms of how are they progressing. So very, very important legislation around L's at the federal level. At the state level, our overriding regulation is Commissioner's Regulations Part 154. It's a 70-something page document. It's linked on this slide. You're welcome to review that. But this paragraph is really the crux of that regulation, and I've actually just, for the sake of time, summarized even that for us. So bottom line is that Commissioner's Regulations Part 154 in the state of New York, this regulation requires districts to provide L's with first and foremost equal access to all school programs and services. It also requires us to provide L's with access that is appropriate to the student's age and grade level, including programs required for graduation. And I highlight that because it's very important. I hear more and more questions about where do we place this L? You know, I have a student who's coming in and they're 17 years old, but they've missed schooling and they speak no English. And so some districts are putting those students in 9th grade just to get them caught up. And it's really inappropriate to do that, right? So it's important to know that in our legislation, it's addressed. And we're also obviously required to provide L's with either a bilingual education program or an E&L program. The vast majority of districts in the state of New York use E&L programs. There are a handful of bilingual education programs in upstate New York and some of our larger school districts, and we see more and more of those actually in New York City. So the other piece that I mentioned to you was the blueprint for LML success. Again, this was the document that was intended to support the rollout of the new regulations. And school leaders and school boards, district leaders, building leaders, they have their own category in this document. And even though this is a colorful, attractive document, it is regulation documents. It's put out by the state of New York and it's a regulatory document. And frankly, what it says is that all district and school leaders are responsible for assuring that academic, linguistic, social, and emotional needs of L's are being addressed. First and foremost, by providing a clear vision, providing high quality instruction for L's. Now, remember what we said, that most of the teachers of L's in the state of New York have not had any extensive training in how to work with them. So that becomes a challenge for a school leader. to provide a safe and inclusive learning environment that respects languages and cultures, and ensuring that school leaders are trained to meet the needs of ELs in order to cultivate a school culture of high expectations, right? We don't want to lessen the expectations for these students, but as Joanne, as you said earlier, we want to give them access. And then finally, a document that you're probably more familiar with is that CRSE framework. I love this document, especially when I'm reviewing E&L programming, because it speaks to all students with a lens for our English language learners, and it hits on 4 main areas, including a welcoming and affirming environment, which is the best way to get that amygdala hijack in check, high expectations and rigorous instruction, inclusive curriculum and assessment, and ongoing professional learning. And so what I want to mention here is, I don't know if you're aware, but in 2022, the Office of Bilingual Education and World Languages was audited by the New York State Comptroller's Office. This is a public document. I've linked it here. You can go through and you can look at the audit. The audit was actually released to the public in 2024, so that was the first time that we heard about it. And the reason I want to share this information with you is because I think it speaks to what our requirements are as school leaders around ELs. And so the Comptroller's Office, this was the feedback from the Comptroller's Office in this audit of the Office of Bilingual Education and World Languages, which is our governing branch at State Ed. So first and foremost, they found that State Ed is not consistently ensuring school districts are properly identifying ELs. That's why the identification process is so important to understand. They found significant gaps in ensuring districts provide required EL instructional services, meaning that there are districts that were audited that were not giving the full complement of E&L programming to their ELs. They found some districts did not have adequate documentation to demonstrate compliance, so paperwork was an issue. They found that State Ed needs to strengthen its monitoring systems and oversight practices to better ensure district compliance. And the reason I share this with you is because, and frankly, this next one, that NYSED must improve guidance and requirements for documentation, so that you are consistently maintaining evidence of identification, proper services for ELs. The reason I share this with you is because this came out in 2024, and this was the call to the Office of Bilingual Education to essentially step up their work in oversight of districts. And so this is why, if you're someone in your district who completes the comprehensive EL education plan every year, if you do that, you know that this past year, SEEP was a bear. It was a bear. And next year's is going to be just as bad, and it's going to be due earlier. So the reason I say this is because if State Ed is increasing their oversight of districts, you want to be aware of that, because you could be open to an audit of your E&L program. So that's why we want to make sure that we understand the identification process. And so when we think about how an L becomes an L, it's really important that it not just live with the E&L teacher, right? So much of the work around L's lives with E&L teachers. And we really need to have a solid understanding of the process. So first and foremost, the home language questionnaire, that's what kicks off the identification process for an L. That is something that every incoming family who registers in a New York State public school must complete. If you have kids in a New York State public school, you probably filled this out. I know I did. And that questionnaire is what then prompts an informal interview. So if on the home language questionnaire, a family notes that a language other than English is present in the home, that prompts an informal interview. That informal interview, and this is very important to understand, that informal interview has to be conducted by someone who is trained to do that, and that is almost always your E&L teacher, and that's great. The informal interview, though, should not be the gatekeeper of whether that child moves on to the next step of the process, which is the NYSETEL. So often I hear E&L teachers say, well, I'm pretty sure from the informal interview that the child is proficient, so I'm not going to give them the NYSETEL. That's really bad practice. First of all, to put a teacher in the position of saying we are not going to give a student, E&L programming based on a single interview, is too much pressure on that teacher. And the only objective measure we have of English language proficiency at this time is the NICETEL. And so that becomes the next step. And I want to talk about that in particular because that is changing, as many of you may know. So when a student comes to us and we give them the NICETEL, that then generates an English proficiency level for that student. And this is incredibly important for leaders to know because your teachers don't know the English proficiency levels of their students. I'm telling you that up front. Time after time after time, I have conversations with teachers. And when we talk about their instruction, the first question I ask is, what's their English proficiency level? Because every decision we make about our L's flows from the English proficiency level. Every instructional decision, every programming decision. And so when I hear that teachers or administrators don't know the proficiency levels of the students and only the ENL teacher knows it, that's a red flag to me. And so the NICETEL sort of categorizes students in these proficiency levels. And so this is really important to note that this entire identification process has to happen within 10 days. It's a very short window. Here's the other thing as school leaders you need to know. You cannot ask a student to not come to school while we're trying to figure out their placement. So a student, even though we have 10 days to sort of go through this process, we have to place students provisionally in a school until the identification process is completed. Now, if you're a district like Shenandoah, my district, where L's went to every building, all 8 elementary schools had L's, this is not a problem, right? We place them in their home district. But if you're a district like, I'm thinking of like Bethlehem, Central School District outside of Albany, they have hub schools, right? Not all of their elementary schools have ENL programming. So students go to a school that may not be their neighborhood school. And we can't hold on that placement simply because we're waiting to determine their L identification. So that can get a little bit tricky. So when we think about programming for our L's, you can see that right off the rip, this is a regulatory document that shows us what kind of programming our L's need, that those proficiency levels drive that. So at K-8, we look at what proficiency level the student is, and that determines if they're going to have standalone ENL alongside their integrated ENL. And this is the 912 document, same thing. And so this is the first decisions we make about a student's programming are around that proficiency level. So it's very important to know. Now, you may have heard that New York is about to become a WIDA state. This is terrific news. We've been asking for this for a really long time. We are the 42nd member to join the WIDA consortium. We do in New York a lot. We wait, right, and see how it's going everywhere else before we hop on board. Well, we waited a really long time for this. So this year, if you have teachers in your buildings or in your district who are in the process of administering the NICE slot, this is the last year that the NICE slot will be administered. Next spring, it will be the WIDA. And this fall will be the last time that the NICETEL is administered. In 2027, it will be the WIDA. And so this is really good news. There's many more states that are part of the WIDA consortium. There is a transition timeline for the WIDA consortium that has been sort of trickled out very slowly, but a lot of folks are asking about training and when are we going to learn more about the WIDA? Our ENL teachers are very nervous about it because it's coming up next year. But there is a plan. The state will be putting that out shortly, but just know that teachers who are administering the WIDA need to be trained in it. They can't administer the WIDA without that training, and that training will most likely be virtual. And there's more to come on that in the fall. So keep that in mind.
Sarah, can you tell us what WIDA means? What the letters mean?
Yeah, it's Wisconsin. It stands for the original states that first started the consortium. They've actually changed. They've actually changed that's the original term WIDA. I believe that in the last few years they've updated it to stand for something that makes more sense for the entire country, but I don't remember what it is. Yeah. I will say the big change from the WIDA is going to be that it is computer based. And so one thing that you as a leader can be thinking about right now is getting your hands on Chromebooks for students so that they can take it, and headphones. Even the speaking will be done on the computer. So that's going to be a big shift, just so you're aware. I'm going to put this up for you and make the recommendation that you can scan this QR code, and it will take you to a page where you can sign up for the WIDA newsletter. The state ed department has been a little slow, or at least, we've been sort of chomping at the bit for more information. It's coming right now. The Arborns are in the process of being trained on the WIDA. But if you want more information on it, the newsletter is really, really helpful. I get something in my inbox every day giving me information about the WIDA and how to prepare for it. So it will give you sort of a head start if you're getting a little nervous about waiting until the fall for more information. Any questions on that? Because I know a lot of folks have been asking about that. Okay, so I want to just kind of make sure that I'm going to skip through a little bit here just in the interest of time. When we're talking about English language learners, it's important to really understand that English as a new language is not an intervention. It is tier 1 instruction. And so we've been kind of beating the drum on this for a bit. Our earliest learners in those earliest proficiency levels, they're required to have something called standalone. And if there was one thing I want school leaders to know about standalone, it's that it is not what a lot of people think it is. Standalone is their English language class, right? Most standalone programs have, or we would recommend that they have, a curriculum. This is where kids go to learn English, starting with hello, how are you? What it is not is a resource room. It's not a homework help. It's not a testing room, right? So if you have a math teacher who says to the ENL teacher, my student didn't finish their math test today, can you give it to them during your time? We hear that a lot. That's highly inappropriate. That would be like asking, the social studies teacher to give the test during social studies, right? This is a content area. We want to be really clear on that. The other component of an ENL program is integrated. What's important to know about the integration or the integrated programming, many of us call this co-teaching, right? Is that we really are trying to move away from this model of what we love to call crouching and whispering, right? Crouching, the ENL teacher in the room is not an aide. They are someone who is fully certified to be a classroom teacher, and their content just happens to be ENL. And so we really want to try to move away from that model. I do a lot of work with co-teaching partnerships and trying to help folks understand how to tap into the expertise of both people in the room. So something there to just sort of keep in mind. And then finally, what is not discussed on the document around the scheduling, of ELs is those content teachers. And that is when students are either in the elementary classroom without an ENL co-teacher, or they are in a content area teacher at this content area class at the secondary level. And those teachers are doing the work without a co-teacher. And these are the ones we're most worried about. These are the ones that have not had a lot of work around this. School leaders ask me a lot of questions around scheduling. This is my best answer for you around scheduling. If you find it to be challenging, if it feels a little bit like hit or miss, like that is normal. There really is not a lot of, it's not easy to do. And one of the reasons it's not easy to schedule ENL is because the scores from the NICETEL don't come back until very late. And that means that we're sometimes scheduling students very, very late in the summer, sometimes in September. So I want you to think about this in terms of what is in your control. So you can't control the scores or the proficiency levels of students. You can't control the release of the NICE slot scores, nor will you be able to control the release date of the WIDA. You can't control your school enrollment. Some of you may be in districts where a bus pulled up and 50 families with L's got out, and that happened to quite a few of my colleagues. What is in your control? You can control when you're doing your screenings. You can think about how to cluster L's so that perhaps students at the earlier levels of proficiency are clustered together in biology versus students at a higher level. It's also really important to think about the co-planning time that your integrated teachers have. This is the number one complaint that we hear from teachers is that they don't have enough time to co-plan, and that's what makes them feel like an aide in the room. And then you can think about whether or not the courses you have are sheltered. There is no ratio like there is in special education. It is perfectly legal and acceptable, and sometimes even preferable, depending on your program and depending on the students, to have an English class with just L's in it. There are other reasons why an integrated program is also really great, and having L's and non-L's in the same room is great, but there's no regulation controlling that. I see I'm coming up on the end of my time here. So I think, and Karen, you can just cut me off whenever. I'll just keep, but I want to really, this is something that I think it's so important for school leaders to understand, is because so few really understand the role of the ENL teacher. In my district, I forbade my ENL teachers from using the term caseload or case manager. They are not case managers. They are content area teachers. Their content is English. It's very important to understand that, because we often treat them as content managers. And the reason we do that is because we didn't have a lot of training in this, right? And so what ends up happening is what we call the invisible tax on multilingual educators. So here's what the ENL teacher is required to do. They are required to teach a full course load. They're required to co-plan and co-teach those integrated courses. Whereas most people, including school leaders, are required to have 15% of their PD hours be around ENL. ENL teachers are required to have 50. Then we have what's good practice. It's really good practice to have your ENL teachers informally collaborate with their science colleagues and their math colleagues, their PE colleagues. And this is really where I think it's important to understand, it is not the role of the ENL teacher to write lessons or modify assignments or assessments for content area and gen ed teachers. They would do it if they could. That's the nature of ENL teachers. But it is not feasible. If they are full-time teachers, it is not feasible for them to also modify all of the content areas of their colleagues. And this is where we struggle, right, in schools, is their colleagues don't have a lot of training in this. So this is where it gets tricky. I would also say to my school leaders, especially my principals, please be really cautious. It's really not appropriate for them to be scheduling classes, state assessments, even the ordering and the organizing and the packing of the NYSA slots and the state assessments. Be really careful around that. We don't ask other content areas to do that. And if you have testing coordinators, they really should be doing that. So just be aware of that. And I would also finally say that it's very often we hear, we need an interpreter for a parent conference, or we need an interpreter for a state assessment. So we call the ENL teacher. It's really not their role. It's not appropriate. So just some things to sort of be thinking about as you're fleshing that out. So I'm going to stop there. I could go for another 3 hours.
Sarah, thank you. There's so much, there's so much to know here and so much to learn. Couple of thoughts. You really started by saying that a primary challenge is that teachers are not trained to work with ENL students, right? So in a typical school that has a regular kind of number, a lowish number of ENL students, a student could have 89% of teachers who are not trained to teach them in particular. The language teacher and the ENL teacher will know about some of those cultural norms, but the regular ed math teacher may not, right? So
Right.
I think what we always get back to is, what is the role of the school leader, right? And so I just want to say that I think it would be tremendously valuable for everyone who's attending today. First of all, everyone who is attending, you will find this presentation posted on the SAANYS website under professional learning. There's a whole section of our Power Hour resources. You will find it there. And I think the crux of the matter is, as a school leader, how can you have better informed teachers. You're not training them, but you're informing them. So a lot of the things that Sarah said today about the role of the ENL teacher, it is this, it is not that, it is this, it is not that. It's important not that we know that as the school leader. Teachers need to know that, because teachers really have the best of intentions when
Yes.
they ask that teacher, hey, can you give him the math quiz during that time? They've never been told that, that's not really the role, like explicitly, right? And some of the things that Sarah did today, where she restricted us, speak with one syllable words, don't use the letter T, that's a faculty room exercise. Teachers like us I started to feel anxious or panicky or something when I tried to do that. And the difference is I'm not sitting in a class of fifth graders who I'm embarrassed in front of, who are my new peers in America. I mean, that's mortifying, right? So how does it feel to be an ENL student? Talking to your teachers about these things and sharing some of the exercises we did and some of the slides that Sarah shared here, resources, the CRSE framework. How many school leaders really know that? Not to mention how many teachers have even heard of it. That's a gold mine of knowledge for teachers. So if you can leave us just kind of thinking about how can I get my teachers who were not, logically, trained to teach ENL students, how can I make them, at least on a small level, feel better informed about certain things? I think that this resource that you're going to leave us with, I think, is a great place to start. And everybody has Sarah's contact information. Again, this will be up on our website. So I just really want to thank you for being here today, Sarah. Like you said, we could learn so much more, but it's just so important to explicitly spell these things out rather than assume that not only school leaders, but teachers know this, because many of them just don't. And
Yeah.
that's something we're responsible for at some point.
And
So
I feel,
thanks
Karen,
again.
like it's one of the things one of the reasons that I like to sort of share this percentage of teachers that haven't had any training is because very often what they need to hear is it's not their fault.
Exactly.
They want to do well, but they don't necessarily know, very often we hear them say, I don't really know what the ENL teacher does, right? And so
Right. That's right.
I want them to know they're not alone in that, and there's a reason for it, and it's not their fault, right? So
Absolutely.
yeah. And I'm happy to hang back. I don't, if people have specific questions, I don't know, Karen, if that's even, or do you have to cut it off?
We're gonna end
Okay.
our meeting for today, but everyone knows how to get in touch